When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel, and today's video we're going to be doing something I don't think I've ever really talked about on this channel, which I'm very surprised by within 3 years worth of making content. I've never talked about Alys Rivers, and part of this is I think because Fire and Blood characters, before House of the Dragon came out, never really did all that well on my channel, so I usually kind of went away from some of the Fire and Blood content, and Alys Rivers is also one of those characters that's very much intertwined in the magical side of the world. We don't know a lot about this character. House of the Dragon kind of took their own liberties with this character, which I actually think they did a really good job of for the most part in season 2, because there just isn't a lot of this character. There's a lot of speculation, but we don't know that much about her. She's kind of like Mel when you're coming into her in A Clash of Kings. Pause. That kind of sounded wild, but you get the point, right? When you're going into Clash of Kings, you've only vaguely heard of this character and you don't understand how she works. It's kind of how Alys Rivers is still viewed if you're going off of the books. And so we're going to try to go through, her adult life, around the dance time period, getting into post-dance, and then speculating what is to come with the character in Fire and Blood Part 2, as this character is one of those characters that doesn't have a resolution. There's a lot of characters that we know parts of their, life. So if you want to look at like Dunk and Egg, we know kind of the beginning and the end. We have a lot of gray area there in the middle. That's kind of the opposite of this character, where we have a good amount of maybe some of the stuff in the middle part of their life, but then they disappear. So part of that is Fire and Blood Part 2 not being out and all of that. So we're going to discuss the character of Alys Rivers and what happened to her in this kind of 18-year gap of her ruling over Harrenhal. But before we do that, we kind of need to unpack the character a bit, kind of go through a little bit of this background and what are some of the important, moments of her life that then we can predict into the future. So for the character of Alys Rivers, she was born in 89 AC, or maybe even a little bit before, anywhere in that area, because when we get to the dance, she's speculated at being around the age of 40. And this is a very interesting talking point because, like a lot of some of the other main female characters within the Targaryen lore, she is somebody that actually ages quite well. And so there's a lot of rumors of, her doing blood magic and bathing in virgin's blood and all this stuff. And so it's a lot of kind of that stuff. Like Alicent has the same type of rumors, just in terms of she is somebody that looks good as she ages, where Rhaenyra does not. Very similar to somebody like Shiera Seastar as well. So that's something that would have kind of been hovering over her head almost her entire life because she aged well. Now, is that because of genetics? Is that because of some sort of magic? Is it some sort of glamour similar to maybe what Melisandre's doing? I do have some Melisandre, I think, comparisons that sneak up, especially towards the post-dance era, that I think are going to be interesting to kind of go through. So stick with me on that part of it. But also, the only other thing I want to kind of bring into the background information before we get to the Dance with Dragons segment of this early part of the video, is that she is allegedly a bastard of Lionel Strong, but there's also rumors that maybe she's even older than that, or maybe even a little younger. This is one of those characters that there's a lot of things that are just thrown at the wall, and you have to choose which one's stuck. And so I'm going to go with she's a bastard of Lionel Strong. But who knows? I mean, this character could be much older than this, similar to like a Melisandre situation. It's one of those things that I find interesting, that the age is very much kind of up for debate, kind of similar to Melisandre. But getting into the dance, because this is when this character actually has real significance that we know of. But we see that Harrenhal switches hands quite a bit. And again, this is going to be a lot of spoilers for House of the Dragon. I'm basically going to go through some major big points of the dance. So if you don't want that spoiled, very much click off this video. This video is not for you. This will spoil future events for the show. But either way, we see that when Harrenhal gets taken over, very similar to the show, she is somebody that survives that. She's basically kind of, I guess, in servitude. There isn't much actually in Fire and Blood about Daemon and Alys Rivers as like any type of relationship that they might have had. The show kind of ran with that idea and made it to where she was kind of playing with Daemon's mind and giving him visions and all this other stuff. That's not made apparent whatsoever in the book, but I could definitely see those things happening. It's just not noted down in Fire and Blood. So I do think that, for instance, a character like Alys Rivers, it seems like she did have the ability to see visions. Now, we're not sure how that works. Is it connected to the old gods, kind of what was shown in the show? I think that would make a lot of sense. Is it something with like Relore, with like Melisandre, but that isn't given any indication that there's any type of Red Priestess, Lord of Light type situation going on with Alys Rivers. She's never described as that. So I would say her visions are much more kind of attuned to what the show did. Again, I think the show did do a lot of good things with Alys Rivers and making her a significant character in this part of the story, where Alys Rivers actually in the book of Fire and Blood isn't significant really until like season 3, season 4 of House of the Dragon, if you're going to go off of when things happen in Fire and Blood. So yeah, I do think she has probably some connection with the old gods and being able to see some visions and things like that. But we then see as Harrenhal falls, Daemon ends up giving up Harrenhal. Daemon goes to King's Landing, and in that time, Aemond now takes over the castle. And this is when things start to really get going for the character of Alys Rivers. And what I think is interesting right away is we're told right away that when Aemon takes the castle, a lot of people are put to the sword and things like that. But one person isn't specifically, and that is Alys Rivers. And there's a bunch of different theories about this based upon just our sources in Fire and Blood. Some people believe that Aemond was taking kind of his spoils of war after taking Harrenhal, and maybe he just saw a pretty face and was like, okay, I'm down to get with that type situation. Or it was some sort of love potion type situation. I would lean on I personally think it was more just a lust type situation with Aemond, and then it developed into something else. I also think that when you think about the character of Alys Rivers, who's described as being very beautiful and all these things and aging really well, I also think she's a very cunning woman, someone that's able to manipulate men really well. And so I think it's a combination of things here that happen. And I'm not a big proponent for love potion theories because I think they dumb down the story quite a bit. Like just going, oh yeah, Alys Rivers did a love potion on Aemon and that's why he has a relationship with her. I think that takes away a lot from characters like Aemon and even, Alys Rivers herself. Yes, that would give her the ability to, have love potions and know how to do this type of magic and things like that. But I think it takes away from her motivations and her actually being able to manipulate people and use her looks, her strengths. I think that takes away from those things. So I personally go with the idea that she basically through manipulation, but also because of her looks, was able to make a relationship with Aemond and being able to survive. Now, from this point, she would be a concubine and or the weird thing is later on, it's basically speculated that Alys Rivers and Aemond marry, just based upon how she says her son is the legitimate true-born son and was the rightful king, succeeding behind Aemond. And so that would imply that at some point they probably did at least get married, or at least that's what Alys is saying ended up happening. But we do see that Alys had a lot of influence over Aemond. When we see the Battle of the Fish Feet, a massive blow to the green side of things, it's said here that Aemond was going to kill the messenger until Alys was able to manipulate him or at least suggest to not kill him. Very similar to, say, Sansa with Dantos in the main story. And so that seems to be what's happening here. Now, the thing I question a lot about with Alys, and this is something that the show has set up that I think is very interesting, is that, we see that Aemond is somebody that creates a lot of violence and all of those things. Was Alys Rivers trying to see that he's a potential threat and trying to weather the storm, trying to get him to have some confrontation with Daemon to end the more dangerous dragon riders and things like that? Because something we're going to see later on is that apparently she had a vision that told her where Daemon was, and that's why Aemond actually goes to confront Daemon, is because of Alys. I wonder if Alys doesn't truly like love or like Aemond all that much. It's more that she's using it to her own gains and things like that. Because you think about the position that she ends up by the end of Dance, where she is basically controlling Harrenhal. The Strongs have all been killed off outside of her, if she is a bastard of Lionel Strong or has some connection to the Strongs, and she ends up ruling Harrenhal for a number of years. So this would be a kind of a way of doing that, and so I very much question Alys Rivers and how much she actually cared about Aemond. But that is something where we do see Aemond did care about her quite a lot, because even when we see later on when Sabitha Frey takes the castle, finding just Alys there, with her pregnancy with Aemond's child. Apparently, we don't know if this is confirmed. This is Aemond's child. We never really get a description of their child together either, so we don't know if he even looks like Aemond in any way. We also know the strong genes are very dominant. We see that with Harwin and Rhaenyra's children, if that is the case, which it's more than likely is. So we don't have a ton of information to back up that yes, this was, Aemon's child. But if we go along the idea that it is, it's an interesting sight Sabitha Frey would have come to. But instantly after this, and again, once again, Alys Rivers is not killed, right? She's not killed or anything by Sabitha Frey when she takes the castle. But then Aemond comes back, liberates the castle more or less, takes Alys Rivers with him. And that's when we jump to the very end of the dance, where you have Daemon and Aemond's face-off. And I already talked about the reason Aemond was able to find Daemon was because of the vision telling Alys where he was, or that's what she tells him anyway. That's what's announced. And Aemond comes to fight Daemon with Alys and their child in Alys's womb. And basically, Alys just has a first-person POV of this fight that's going on. She would have been the few people that actually would have seen this event happening, which is very interesting given what we get in Fire and Blood. Who was around to really see what was going on? We're told it was really just Daemon, Aemond, and Alys. I guess there could have been people in the surrounding areas that maybe would have seen it. Dragons are very large. You would have seen them from a good amount of distance. And even when they crashed and fell, you would have felt that, if you're any miles from when this actually occurs. But the point of this ends up being, though, is that she watches the two most dangerous fighters and dragon riders of both sides die. That's what we're told anyway. Could there be some situation where maybe one of them was able to live and we don't know about it? Possibly. There's not really a lot of evidence to support that, but that is a possibility, just given on the narration of Fire and Blood is not to be relied upon all the time. And when you really think about it, the lack of witnesses that there would have probably been. But that gets us then to the post-dance era. So this is going to get us into the Aegon III reign. And this is where it becomes very interesting, because in 131 AC, the last of the Strongs is really killed off with Larys Strong. So you then would kind of turn your attention to Harrenhal. And in 132 AC, only 2 years, right, after the events of the dance, and also 1 year after Larys's death, it seems that Alys starts gathering men to her. I think she would have been able to foresee that Harrenhal would have been a place people that would have been looking towards. Who would get it next after the Strongs? So Alys then has some men, and so Aegon's council doesn't really know to the extent of what's going on in Harrenhal. It'd be very mysterious. You're thinking about the dance and the events that took place there. I think they very much overlook the threat that Alys possesses. And I don't blame them whatsoever. You hear about this random woman that was possibly Aemon's woman, and how does she have all these men, all this stuff? It seems like very much like an outlaw area, right? Like Lady Stoneheart-esque situation. And so Aegon's council, which is mainly Tywin Lannister and Unwin Peake, they end up sending Regis Groves and Daemon Derry to lead about 100 men to Harrenhal to deal with the situation. But upon their arrival, they note that Alys, announcing herself as Aemon's widow, and presented a small boy who she alleged was his true-born son and rightful king. This is a very big proclamation. We are only, a couple years removed from the dance, and even the endings really of the dance. You think about things like Larys Strong and all those things. Like, I don't even consider the dance events really over until Aegon III truly takes his throne. So you think about that threat. That's a big threat. That's another claimant to the throne that people can rally behind. Now, the crown would be lucky in the situation that this child is extremely young. They would have to be less than 2 or 3 years old. They're not a huge threat on that part of it, right? They could use the baby in his name and all of that stuff. We don't even know the name of this child, by the way, but it's still a sizable threat. Now, they only had 100 men, and you're trying to siege Harrenhal. You're going to need more men than that. And we even see something happen very suspiciously. Regis, who I just told you was kind of the leader of this party, he says something insulting Alys or something of that note, and we have very different claims of what happened to him. Some say that magic burst his head, others a crossbow bolt, or even a slinger. Now, I think it's very fascinating that this isn't concrete information that we know. Is it the fact that many people saw different things? People that believed in Alice's magic believed one thing and others didn't? Because this is something that would have probably happened very quickly, right? One, you're looking over here, you're not looking at Regis, and then all of a sudden, boom, his head pops off. Who knows what could have happened? And so this is very suspicious right away. It starts this, I would say, persona around Alys Rivers, where if she already wasn't a very mysterious and almost witch-like character, this is where it would begin. And so, yeah, we don't really know what happened here. I would probably assume that this was more like a slinger or an arrow or a bolt shot than it was magic. But I do think going forward, there is some more magical things that end up occurring. Following that, though, her men leave the castle, routing the loyalist forces and sending back about 32 men of the around 100 men to Derry, being led by another Daemon, not the Daemon of the dance, Daemon Derry. And this wouldn't stop here. Alys would then send a messenger of the loyalist forces. Now, the loyalist forces, some were captured, and this messenger reported that they were being tortured and they were dying, and that there was a dragon within. Now, I'm going to talk about that kind of in the unknown section as we go through, if there actually was a dragon here. But I do think that's a bold claim to make, and that's something that would gain a lot of attention if believed. And he noted that if anyone laughed at his message, he would die, and that if anyone came to the castle and did not submit, they would die. So this is a very interesting claim, because when we do see happen, is almost even more magical. Someone laughs at him, and the man died, but there was accounts saying that imprints of a woman's hands choked the life from him. Now, this is something interesting, because nobody seems to see spirit or anything choke him, and kill him, but I do believe this was probably a shadow baby. We don't know, he was talking to him in the night or whatever, but I personally believe that, similar to Melisandre, a shadow baby was used to kill this messenger, possibly. Now, how that would have been done, especially because Mel is from R'hllor and all of that, and Alys is not that, it's unclear, but it does seem that there was magic used. Maybe you could have made the observation that these men really hard crafted this story of building up Alys as this magical being because they didn't want to take Harrenhal or something like that, or they were believing in tales of that. But it's going to be hard to have an entire group of men witness a man just spontaneously combust, basically, after he told you what would happen if you did something. It's very weird. So this would then get back to the capital. Daemon would go tell his tale to the council, and this was met with mixed reactions. Tywin Lannister took this quite seriously and was very concerned, but on the other hand, Unwin Peake was not concerned at all. He didn't believe this, and he was planning another attack. But before it could go off, it was thwarted by the winter fever of that year. And we're going to talk about the winter fever quite a bit, because I think it's important. But the other part of this is, in 133 AC, there's a lot of stuff going down, right? You need the king, who needs a new wife to have more heirs, and that's a huge, conflict of interest thing for Unwin Peake. There's just a lot of stuff going on to where I think one of my main arguments for why Alys Rivers was able to rule Harrenhal for so long, a lot of that comes down to the people that were involved. So the people that have been mainly involved in this Alys plotline have been Tywin Lannister and Unwin Peake, the people looking over this thing, and the circumstances of what's going on in King's Landing. So at this point, we definitely delve into the unknown. This is basically taking some stuff we know from the very end of Fire and Blood, mixing it with other information that we do know, and trying to fill in the gaps, which we have almost no information on. So a lot of this is going to be left up to interpretation. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on it, but this is really where the start of this video goes from, right? Of predicting what happens in this gray area. Because at this time, so 133, this is when the second attack on Alys was being planned. It doesn't happen, and nobody else is named to ruling Harrenhal until 151 AC with Lucas Lawston. So what occurred in those 18 years that allowed for Alys to presumably rule with her son growing up with it, which is Aemond's as well, as she claims. What occurred there? Now, I want to take a bit of a step back. I want to take a picture of what was going on in the capital. During the year of 133 AC, like I talked about, you had the winter fever. This impacted the capital a crazy amount. You had a character like Tywin Lannister, somebody overlooking this campaign against Alys, die. You had Alicent Hightower finally dying, a remnant of the dance, being gone. A lot of different lords died, and you also had a fifth of the population of King's Landing die. That was even worse in other areas like the Vale, for instance. And so the winter fever very much was way more of a priority than something like what was going on at Harrenhal. People wouldn't have cared nearly as much. And then you also have, other issues, right? That during this time, the king needed to marry somebody. Everybody was bringing in their daughters, trying to get them married to this person or that person. And then it also leads to Unwin Peake's dismissal in 134 AC. So the main two people that were taking up a stance against Alys, sending men to fight her and all those things, one of them is dead and the other one's not really in charge anymore. And so I think a lot of the relevant people that would have been worried about the Alys, issue aren't even in power anymore by the end of 134 AC. So I think on one hand, it's that Alys and her issue definitely went down the priorities, and also the people that were involved and knew about what was going on also were not there anymore. And so those two things are very important to understand here. Not that I think those two things alone is why Alys was able to rule for that long, but there are major factors in it. Now, another factor you have to remember, I'm going to talk about this more towards the end as well, is who's the king. Aegon III is the king at this time. He's not somebody that was very hands-on at ruling. He had struggled from deep depression and anxiety and things like that because of the way the dance ended and things that he grew up seeing and being basically thrown into. He was not somebody that took a hands-on approach to ruling and didn't seem to care about ruling all that much. He was a bit better during the earlier days, but even towards the later days, he basically wasn't even ruling. It's kind of like, for instance, an Aerys the First and Bloodraven situation is what kind of occurs later on in his reign. And so let's kind of then get to the Alys side of it. What was Alys doing during this time that enabled her to continue ruling? So I think the first thing is you have this mysterious, thing hovering over Harrenhal and Alys. Does she have this alleged dragon? Which, if you look at the time period we're in, the dragons were slowly dying out. I shouldn't say slowly, fastly. There was only a couple remaining, and those would then all die out during this time period, I should say. So that was a major threat. The other part of it is I think that Alys was very much in a situation where she couldn't try to put her son on the throne at this time. Her son would have been, again, by 134 AC, probably only like 2 or 3 or maybe 4 at the most. There was no reason to try and put an infant on the throne and all of that stuff, and you just didn't have the backing yet to try it. So I don't think that Alys pushed her claim yet. I think that that's part of it. I don't think that she wanted to put her son in that danger yet. She was going to use that as a threat of people trying to attack her, but when you have the whole population recovering from, a terrible time in 133 AC, she gets faded to the background, and I don't think Alys was pushing the issue either. So I think she just kind of remained silent, waiting for her time. And that's, I think, a lot what was going on at the time. And I think it even makes more sense when you think about the timing of events. So when she gets, it would appear, taken out of Harrenhal, or when she stops becoming the active ruler of Harrenhal in 151 AC, her child would have been around 20 years old, which would have been a very interesting age to then start doing some actions where you're trying to press, your son's claim to the throne out there. That would have then attracted attention. And then it also is going to lead up to something else I'm going to talk about towards the end when we get into the end of Aegon's reign, because the end of Aegon's reign is somewhat very close to the end of her reign at Harrenhal. And so I want to talk about why I think those things could be linked, and also another event that was happening around this time that would have led to maybe why Alys finally got that attention and was taken out of Harrenhal. So when we get to this idea of a dragon and her having one, I very much think this was an illusion. I think this was more than likely some sort of glamour or trick. Remember, she could have possibly had some access to the corpses of the dragons, being relatively close to Harrenhal. she could have maybe had one of the corpses and was using it as a glamour, being able to, physically change it while you still have like a practical effect, more or less. You still have the dragon's body, it's just dead. Maybe she was able to use some magic. That would have been something that maybe would have been very difficult for her to do. But I do think it's the most likely option. We don't hear anything about a dragon at Harrenhal during this time period at all, outside of this one messenger who is really messed up, tortured, all this stuff. Who knows if he can even be relied upon that he actually saw one. But if she did, I think it had a lot to do with probably some of the tricks that Melisandre is using to make people see things that weren't actually there. Also, it could be a metaphor to her son being a Targaryen, being a dragon, and him rising to take power. So there's a couple different meanings, but I don't think there was an actual literal, dragon at Harrenhal. That just doesn't seem to be supported in the text whatsoever. So then the lingering question then occurs. What happened to her son? Her son, she claims, had the Targaryen blood from Aemond Targaryen, but we don't hear about this character. We don't really hear about this character being very significant. For instance, in A History of Westeros, in that book, we don't hear about anything really from this child. And so what I likely think occurred is I think the kid was either, I think depending on what happened, I think the kid was either killed or was sent to the wall. Those to me are my likely options. I don't think that his line survived. It just doesn't seem to add up with the story we've gotten. It would seem to be more of a bigger thing if that line survived. You think about, for instance, like the Blackfires, the Bright Flames. You would assume there'd be some sort of rumors about a potential Alys Rivers line that just doesn't seem to exist in the story. Now, this could be something that George added in quite later on, which is very likely the case. Fire and Blood came out, last after the books and, all that stuff. So it's very likely that this is something that he hasn't really developed much in other, content that he has. So there is a possibility that maybe the way he lived on was, one, he went into hiding and never really revealed his parentage and just kept that going. Another idea some people have put out there is that maybe the reason House Lawston got Harrenhal is because maybe he married into their house, and so that was kind of a peaceful way of pleasing the crown, because you put somebody that you wanted on Harrenhal and getting Alys Rivers out of control while also satisfying Alice. Maybe that's possible. I don't like that option as much. I personally think that he either died or went to the wall. That is something people have thrown out there that I do find that could be very interesting. The one thing I just don't like about that idea, though, as well, is for Alice. Now, Alys Rivers to me is somebody that I just don't see how that adds up, given that the first time somebody comes to Harrenhal, she announces that her son has the rightful claim, all this stuff. I just don't feel like she would just abandon that out of nowhere. Or maybe she became more of a mother. She started to understand that that's just not possible with the situation of Westeros. Maybe. Again, we're kind of just speculating at nothing right now. We have no information to back up any of these ideas I'm bringing up. It's just me trying to rationalize through things. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of where I think her son's fate is. Now, Alice herself is quite interesting. I think Alice could have lived on past this, and maybe she became maybe one of these other popular figures we talk about. Maybe she could be Melisandre herself. We're never given a date or, a way or how that Alys Rivers died. That to me is suspicious. The way that we're never told how this character truly dies or anything like that. Maybe that's because this character was specifically written in Fire and Blood, and so that made it to where we didn't really have that information yet, and George is waiting for Fire and Blood Part 2, which I think inevitably we will get a lot more of this in Fire and Blood Part 2. But I think there's a possibility that she could have lived on to somebody like Melisandre. Their magic seems very similar. The way they're described is very similar in terms of their actions, I should say. But I don't know. I mean, I think Alice to me is just one where you really don't know. But kind of, getting back to the whole question of this video is, how did she control Harrenhal for so long? I think it comes down to the timing of things. I think she was very much off the radar for a good amount of time while the crown or the throne was dealing with other more important issues. But I think the reason that eventually it caught up to her and her child was that we get this idea of an imposter Daeron. So the brother of Aegon and Aemond, somebody that hasn't been introduced in House of the Dragon yet, but Daron, the character that is one of my favorite characters during the dance, he is somebody that it appears has this imposter. There are people parading him out as being this new claimant to the throne, and Aegon and his brother Viserys, who will end up becoming Viserys the second, the other one of the other kids that's shown to Viserys in season one. But we end up seeing that Viserys is the person that really becomes in charge during the latter years of Aegon's reign, which would fit this time period. 151 AC, Aegon's going to die in a few years after this. So Viserys was the person really ruling. And Viserys is somebody that, going through, he's going to be hand of the king for a number of kings. He's going to become king for a short amount of time in his own right. He seems a very good hand, very good politician. He is somebody that instantly tries to settle down this threat of Daron, rising back up out of the ashes of being dead. And I think this makes sense that this event would have brought a lot of attention to what was going on at Harrenhal. And you specifically add that timeline up where around when this would have been happening, you have this character that would have been possibly Aemond's blood, who would have been in his teenage to growing up years, anywhere in that like 16, to 20, 21, age range. That's when you would see somebody like that try and press their claim. I think it's very likely that because of, this, we also would have seen another type of, oh, is this guy going to have a claim? Can people rally behind him? And Viserys takes care of that for Aegon before he dies. I think that's the most likely route of what led Alys to then having to leave Harrenhal or die, whatever we see end up happening with the character. But let me know what you guys think. I think that is my best shot at going at the character of Alys Rivers. Again, a character that I'm not the most familiar with in terms of the post-dance stuff and where I go with that, because I am someone that doesn't really have a lot of big thoughts on the magic of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's not the thing that I'm the most interested in, but it's something that in the poll I did about a week or two ago, it was the second most voted option. So I thought I'd give it to you guys. I thought it'd be something fresh and interesting for me that I haven't covered on the channel. And it would just be something that would be, nice for you guys, because I haven't talked about the character before. You guys don't know my thoughts on the character really outside of just House of the Dragon related stuff. But yeah, I hope you guys all enjoy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the character and possibly what's going on in Fire and Blood Part 2 with the character. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.